In 2014, the United Kingdom almost came undone. Advocates for Scottish independence were finally granted a referendum. The future of Scotland's political arrangements was in the hands of the Scottish people. Needless to say, the debate at that time was intense. While serving as principal and vice-chancellor of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, Dame Louise Richardson held the line on freedom of thought and speech after being pressured to tone down her comments about the Scottish referendum on independence, a story that we're going to get into today. She then went on to lead the University of Oxford and is now leading the Carnegie Corporation of New York as its 13th president. I'm honored to speak with her today about her approach to leadership and the lessons she's learned along the way. I'm your host, Dr. Kathleen McInnis, and this is Smart Women, Smart Power. This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women. First, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We're just thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, so I'd love to start with your origin story. I mean, I'd just love to know, like, what brings people into this weird field of international security and international affairs. What drew you in?
Well, I grew up in rural Ireland in an environment that was steeped with Irish history. I was always fascinated by Irish history. In my teenage years, Northern Ireland exploded, so I became very interested in politics and saw contemporary Irish politics through the historical lens. I grew up as a rabid nationalist, spoke Irish in preference to English at one point. And it was only when I went to university that I learned another entirely different version of Irish history. And I became fascinated by how two sets of people occupying the same tiny island could have diametrically opposed interpretations of the same historical events. Right. So I had felt, having been suffused by Irish nationalism in my youth, decided I wanted to break away from it and decided to get as far away as possible from Ireland and nationalism, I thought, by studying international relations. Which, of course, was just another way of looking at the same subject. So that's how I got drawn in. I got a scholarship to come to America, ended up doing graduate work in America. In the field of international security, I didn't work on Ireland for many, many years. But I became drawn to the question of terrorism because I read all the literature on terrorism, and I felt it was oversimplified. It saw terrorists as one-dimensional bad guys and psychopaths, and I felt it was altogether more complicated than that. So I got drawn into working on terrorism, trying to understand how people in some facets of their life could be kind parents, constructive members of their community, and then join groups that violate every ethical code in pursuit of a goal they're not going to exist. So I became fascinated by that.
What were your findings? Like, what were the things, or your major observations as a result of your research?
Well, initially it was that precisely that, having known people who had joined terrorist groups, they were not one-dimensional. They were not psychopaths. They were, for the most part, disillusioned idealists, or they were rather idealists who perceived themselves as acting ethically, who perceived themselves as being the good guys, as the David against the Goliath. And I thought there was just a complete absence of understanding between the terrorists and those countering them, which is not to sympathize with them, but really just as an effort to understand them, or academically, an effort to understand this critically important phenomenon, although this was long before 9/11, when terrorism became a global preoccupation.
How did the events of 9/11 transform that discipline, and your reflections on these terrorist groups, rather?
Well, the discipline was completely transformed. Up until then, there was a small group, it was a marginalized field. In fact, one of my senior colleagues said to me at one point, "You've got to get out of this terrorism business. It's academic suicide." And it was because there was no clear theoretical underpinning for the study of terrorism. So it was really just a small handful of people across universities, some in different disciplines, some historians, anthropologists, political scientists, psychologists studying terrorism around the world, but a small handful of people. After 9/11, of course, it was transformed. The vast amounts of money.
There was a lot of sudden terrorism experts. I would just say, right, yeah,
and a large amount of money made available to fund research, and a lot of new people coming into the field. People who had previously worked on the Cold War, and I think they brought much Cold War military style thinking into the field of terrorism. They dismissed people like me as incurably wet, and they saw terrorism as another kind of military threat that could be defeated militarily, which was a very different approach to the one I was advocating.
It's funny. I was told back in the day, don't study NATO. Nobody's going to care about NATO. Like, yeah. Being a NATO nerd has been helpful. So how have these experiences tied into how you lead the Carnegie Corporation and how you think about where research needs to go?
Well, I think it shows the importance of investing in areas which aren't fashionable at the moment, trying to look beyond today to the issues that will be important or being neglected, trying to find the people working in those areas, trying to be open to those people who are not studying the fashionable subjects so that we can support them. So it's always looking out for the marginalized who might have a skill that's really important, or a knowledge on a sphere that's really important but neglected.
Well, so the decision that you brought with you today to talk about happened in 2014. And it's when you were leading the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And the referendum was announced. So could you walk us through, like, what was it like to be in one of the leading academic institutions in Scotland, and all of a sudden, like, this big political grenade is just thrown into, I guess, everybody's lap, not just yours?
Well, it was an intense time, a febrile time. The Scottish government was led by Alex Salmond, who was a very charismatic, formidable, accomplished leader. He was also a graduate of St. Andrews. And the government was bound and determined that this was their one chance to get independence for Scotland. And of course, all universities in Scotland are publicly funded. So the government made absolutely apparent that they expected support and would absolutely not tolerate any opposition. And again, it's a small community, so there was a lot of pressure applied. My concern was that as head of a university, we have to be able to debate all sides of every issue, and people need to feel open to do so. So shortly after, a recent university was put under pressure because a faculty member had hosted a lecture, and this faculty member was sanctioned. And this had a really chilling effect on our faculty. So I sent an email to the entire faculty saying, whatever your views on independence, please feel free to express them. Any external pressure will end at my door. We're a university. Our job is to debate these issues. This is a critically important issue to Scotland, and people rightly look to us to debate it fully. So I hosted events with people on both sides, and I would say the government had made clear that universities could not take a position, which in some respect was reasonable enough.
Sure.
In the sense of institutions funded.
Institutions don't take positions. Sure.
So there's a lot of debate today. We're talking in the spring of 2024 about universities and speaking out. And there's, I think, a general move towards the Chicago approach of not speaking out. I would say, as somebody who's led universities, it's extremely difficult to maintain that position. I have tried to maintain the position. The one exception I would make is when the interests of the university are so clearly involved. So when it came to independence, I was quite public about the fact that if Scottish universities were to lose access to nationwide, which is to say Britain-wide research funding, it would be a catastrophe for us. So I made that point in a in an interview on a completely different subject. It was an interview about a film with Sean Connery that we made to mark the 600th anniversary of the university.
As one does.
So in an aside, I was asked about this, and I said what I had always done: loss of access to research funding would be devastating for Scottish research universities, and went on to talk about Sean Connery, the film, and 600 years, and so on. And several days later, before the article was published, I got a call from the First Minister, who was Alex Salmond, saying, what did you say to the Times? And that led to a very unpleasant conversation where a robust conversation, I should say, where he read to me a statement that I was about to issue, that I was going to issue.
Wait, so a statement? He was reading you a statement
that I was going to issue.
Oh, that's...
And I said, I'm terribly sorry, First Minister, I can't do that. And he said, no, Louise, you don't understand. Your communications team have this. The second I hang up the phone, this statement is being issued. And I said, I really don't think that's a good idea, First Minister, because I can't issue this statement. He said, Louise, the statement is going out now. And I said, I really would advise against that, First Minister, because if it goes out 2 minutes later, I'm going to have to issue another saying this was not my statement.
Wow.
Which led to quite an unpleasant and robust conversation.
I love the use of the word robust in this context. I love that. I'm going to have to use that.
In any event, I didn't issue the statement. The sequel to this, of course, was that word got out about this conversation, not through me, but I hadn't realized that there were several people in his office
listening in on
the call. And in fact, they had an open line to our comms team. So lots of people actually heard this meeting at the receiving end of this very unpleasant conversation. So as soon as the phone hung up, I got an email from our comms team, gave me the statement. I said, I'm terribly sorry, we are not issuing the statement. And that was the end of it as far as I was concerned, until word got out in the media that this had happened. And there was a lot of talk at the time of kind of bullying of people within Scotland, and intimidation to ensure people didn't oppose independence. But there was never any evidence of it. There was just a lot of talk.
Oh.
So I started getting calls from journalists asking about this conversation. I refused to talk. I refused to say anything about it. And then I got a Freedom of Information request.
Oh.
And my initial response was, Freedom of Information request, there's nothing, because it was a phone call. But of course, there were the emails. So the second decision I had to make was, do I release these emails, or do I sit on them as long as possible until after the referendum?
Right.
So that was a tough decision, but I decided to release them. And then so on the day of the referendum itself, they were my emails and the details of this conversation were splashed across the front page of the paper.
How did that feel?
How did that feel?
Like,
not very nice,
right? I mean, because like there's women, especially, get harassed online, and being the center of this media thing in this very heightened political time. Yeah, how did you do self-care in that moment? How do you?
Well, you didn't do much self-care. You just cope. You just, what can you do?
Right.
So that evening, because the referendum was that day, I then got a message from the First Minister's office. He wants to speak to you. Please give us your private phone, your private mobile number. So I did give my private mobile number and turned off my phone because I figured by the next day the result would be known.
Yeah.
If the referendum was lost by the government, they'd have bigger problems than dealing with me. If they won, I was going to have a very difficult time.
Right.
Right. And we know how it transpired. So that was the end of it. But I think, it was an important moment, because it was important to stand up for our academics' right. And I had to model that behavior, their right to have any view they wanted and to express it freely. And then on the responding to the FOI, I just felt the dogs of the street know there's intimidation going on and nobody is saying it. So here's the evidence.
Yeah. Well, how did the academic community respond to your standing up?
Oh, I think they were very pleased. I mean, within St. Andrews, I think they were really pleased. I don't think my peers, the heads of other universities, were so pleased. Mm-hmm. And clearly the government wasn't terribly pleased. Mm-hmm. But, I'm an academic, and this is what academics should do, and this was what we had to do. So it wasn't a difficult decision, actually. It was an unpleasant one, but not a difficult one.
We live in a political climate that is highly fractious, and in which, at least my observation, rightly or wrongly, is that a number of academic institutions have decided to take a risk-averse approach to the debates, and sort of we hide down, hunker down, we focus on some small stuff, and just we can coast through. I wonder the counter being like, if we don't rise to these issues and take these analytic risks, that we won't be able to be relevant. We won't be able to shape these debates in useful ways. I just wonder your reflection on that discourse.
Well, this is an enormously difficult time to be a university president, so I congratulate myself on my timing on that. There was no skill involved in the timing. I had to step around. But as I say, the consensus seems to be moving that universities shouldn't opine on issues. I would just say that's a very, very difficult position to maintain. I remember after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, just getting these emails, nonstop emails through the night from faculty demanding that I issue a statement. And my saying, look, the poor people in the bomb shelters in Kiev are not worried about what Oxford faculty are saying about Kiev. Right. And my faculty countering, absolutely, we're a global institution. It would really mean a lot to them. My pushing back and said, look, let's take our time here. We're not, and universities need to remember that we're not 24-hour news channels. We do not have to respond immediately to everything, and I don't think we should. My pushback there was, let's wait till we can do something that's useful and then announce that. And in fact, my colleagues at Oxford were amazing. We raised funding for 20 fully funded scholarships for students from Ukraine, which we announced. And that's what I think universities should do. But it is a difficult position to maintain. And the reason I think that so many university presidents have found themselves in a particularly difficult position now is that having opined on issue after issue after issue, and then suddenly saying, well, we're not going to opine on this particular one. Well, of course, the people who care about this particular issue are going to feel very angry about it. And that was one of the arguments I used to make as to why I didn't want to issue a statement on any given issue, because where do you draw the line? Nobody's asking anyone to make statements about what's happening in the Sudan at the moment, and there's 10 million displaced people, more than in Gaza and in Ukraine, and nobody's asking us. So do we not make a statement there? Mm-hmm. So I actually think we should allow for the expression of all views in universities, but as an institution, unless the interests of the institution are directly involved, I don't think we should.
That's really interesting as well, because we're the buzzword to be sure that drives some people nuts, rightly so. The polycrisis. We're in this world in which there's multiple simultaneous crises. How do you draw that line? How do institutions navigate this, and how do you navigate the debates? How do you have a response on Gaza? How do you respond? Exactly what you're saying.
Well, I don't think we need to respond, certainly not as an institution. I think how we respond as an educational institution is to facilitate discussion.
And education.
Yeah.
And scholarships.
And education about the background to the crisis, and model to our students how you handle difficult arguments, have faculty with different points of view, model to students how to argue respectfully, not do the sort of rage du jour, disrespectful discourse, which we just also see happening so frequently. Just don't belong in a university. I think we have to go back to what a university is all about. It's about bringing all universitatis. It's about bringing all ideas, people from all over together to explore all ideas. And it's got to be a place to do that. And so this notion that has become popular in recent years, especially in this country, that education universities should be comfortable places and everybody should feel comfortable. I think the opposite. I think one should be discomforted by one's education. That's what education is about, to rob you of your certitude, to cause you to question. And I'm speaking because of course, my own experience going to Trinity College Dublin as a Catholic convent girl with this view of Irish history and being taught by English professors an entirely different version of Irish history.
Yeah,
that was fascinating and totally educational.
Well, leading the Carnegie Corporation now, how? I'm going to ask the question I asked earlier. Again.
Sorry.
No. Because I just there's so much richness to this question, right? How do you take this this incredible experience you've had at the center of these debates and leading these global institutions? How are you translating that into priorities at the Carnegie Corporation?
Well, there is such an alignment between my career and the Carnegie Corporation, in the sense that the two areas where Carnegie has worked for decades and decades have been promoting peace and advancing education, and then over the past 25 years, added strengthening democracy. Well, I've spent my entire life in education. My work, one could argue, is designed is an exploration of ways to promote peace. And strengthening democracy, I think, is a requirement to achieve anything on either the peace front or the education front. So there is a complete alignment. And forgive me for getting off on the tangent.
No, it's not, not at all. Not at all.
So it's just an extraordinary privilege to be given the leadership of this institution, which is so clearly aligned with my own interests. The challenge, of course, is that the scale of the problems and the scale of the resources to address them is an enormous delta between the two. But it is an amazing privilege to go out and try and find people who are really having an impact on improving education, who are really managing to build peace in different parts of the world and providing them some support. I mean,
that's pretty awesome.
It's really awesome. Yes.
And it's funny how, it's always in retrospect, it seems like your career has like a defined path, or like it was intentional. It's like, no, I actually kind of did some stuff.
Absolutely not. No, not. And I've talked to students about this a lot. Now, my career was not planned at all. It was all about seeing an opportunity and going for it. And most jobs I've gotten, and especially St. Andrews and Oxford, I did not expect to get. I was more surprised than anyone when I did.
Well, so I love your sense. Do you feel that your gender as a woman had an impact on your position and in your decision relative to the Scottish referendum? If so, why? If not, why not?
I don't honestly think it had a major influence. I don't know. Would Salmond have been as robust if I were a male? Probably more so would be my guess. Maybe he held, not that he pulled many of his punches.
The punching bags.
To be in that instance, I don't think my gender was that important. I think it was very important that I have a strong enough sense of self that I could withstand his effort to intimidate and so on,
Yeah.
and browbeat. But I don't actually think it was gendered per se. I do think a lot of the coverage of my tenure in both institutions, of course, was gendered. In both cases, in the case of St. Andrews, I was the first woman in 600-year history of the university, and Oxford is so old we don't quite know how old, but about 900 years, and again, the first woman. So that, and especially in Scotland, because there was the whole saga around golf, and with which you may or may not be familiar, but the Royal and Ancient Golf Course Club is the oldest and most prestigious golf club in the world.
Really?
Yes, and it's based in St. Andrews.
I did know that.
And they had always given the head of the university honorary membership, but of course they didn't admit women. So so that was quite, for my first couple of years in Scotland, I was more famous for golf, which I don't play, than for anything else.
Funny how that works. Well, and I guess to conclude our conversation, I'd love your reflections or thoughts on, especially when we're dealing with so many different crises and you've been in these different institutions. What is power? What does power mean to you?
Well, Richard Newstead wrote a book years ago about the American presidency, and he said presidential power is the power to persuade. And I've always thought of power as the opportunity to persuade. So the roles I've had, especially leading universities, you can't tell academics what to do. You have to persuade them. Usually tell them this is your idea. But it is a very privileged position that gives you an opportunity to try to persuade people. So the notion of top-down direction, the classic notions of power, that have never been part of my experience. I see it more as harnessing the skills around you, surrounding yourself with people who have different skills to you, and persuading others to join you in whatever it is you want to achieve. And then, success is when they decide they do want to do whatever it is with you. So that, to me, is what's power. It's about connecting people, connecting skills, engaging with people, persuading them. I mean, the best defense I've always thought against making a bad decision is to have to defend your thinking to skeptical others first.
Yes.
And so I've always tried to do that. Which is, it's a way of just leaning on others and optimizing all the skills around you.
But also making them part of the team.
Oh,
if everybody's
entirely
contributing to the solution, everybody feels ownership.
Absolutely. Nothing is achieved by individuals in this world, and certainly any of the things with which I'm credited, I could not have achieved were I not working with a terrific group of people.
Louise Richardson, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a terrific and just enlightening and hilarious conversation.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it too.
Okay, let's get